You cannot use them in an ahistorical way. Or if you are using the word like Indian literature, then you have to keep in mind that it's not equivalent to something like British literature. There is a lack of equivalence that is brought about by different historical contexts and different meanings that these terms cover, right? So these are two important things that we discussed, and then we went on to discuss various theories of literature in India. We looked at Bharat's Natya Shastra, and we discussed what is Rasa Sutra and Bharat's idea of rasa. We also looked at the Sanskrit ideas of plot, right, and language, and we looked at the question of vastu and artha prapti and so on as ideas of Sanskrit plot, right? And there are differences from the Aristotelian notions of plot. So we discussed all these, right? So we discussed Sanskrit poetics, and we discussed Mudra Rakshas as an example of Sanskrit play. And we discussed how it evokes history. Though the play is written somewhere probably in 5th century, it talks about something that happened 1000 years before that play was composed, right? And it talks about the Mauryan Empire, one of the biggest empire that existed in India, and the crisis in Mughal Empire. I'm sorry, Mauryan Empire, right? The establishment of Mauryan Empire. I'm very sorry. That was the foundation of which was laid by Chanakya, right? And Chandragupta, and the whole legend of Chanakya. We don't know whether the events that are discussed in this play are really historical, right? Whether it is itihasa, but it's definitely legendary, right? And it is written at the time when the Gupta Empire is in a state of crisis, facing the attacks from Central Asian tribes of Huna. And it's a beginning of decline of the great Gupta Empire. And Gupta dynasty, Gupta Empire is considered, that phase in history is called a golden phase for some reason, because some of the most important writers like Kalidas, like Bhavabhuti, and earlier playwright like Bhas, right, belong to this period. This is also the period in which the Sanskrit sutra literature gets codified, especially shastras like Manav Dharma Shastra or Manusmriti, which has very rigid understanding of Varna Jati system, right? This is also the period in which the emperors would patronize almost all religion, all panthas, very similar to what Ashok was doing, though Ashok was promoting primarily Buddhism. He did not take off his patronage to other panth or other dharmas like the Vedic dharma, right, which is also called the Sanatana dharma. So he did not stop patronage or support that religion, but he largely promoted Buddhism, and Buddhism was largely a kind of severe criticism of Vedic Brahmanism, and they have a very different kind of theology, metaphysics, philosophy, and so on. Avedika dharma like Jainism and Buddhism, right? But by the time you reach Gupta period, we find that Gupta emperors are also doing more or less the same thing, and you find it being expressed in Ajanta and Ellora caves. Probably they were made. Some of them were made by under Rashtrakutas and others, Satvahans, but also by later on by Guptas. Rashtrakuta and Satvahan belong to the turn of the millennium dynasties in Deccan and on the subcontinent. Then, as we proceeded, we looked at the whole question of bhakti, and by that time we have seen that the social and political and cultural environment has totally changed because of the rise of various kinds of Islamic regimes like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, right? And all these various dynasties, including very regional ones like the Sultans of Gujarat and Sultans of Deccan, apart from the Delhi Sultanate and also the Sultans and Nizams of Hyderabad and all that, right? So these people are of different ethnicities and different politics, right? To conceive them as a single monolithic Islamic or Mughal history is, in my view, stupid. Because most of these sultanates were at war with each other. They were all fighting each other. And had they been following a common Islamic theological or political project, then they all would have been united, which they never were. They were always at war. And they would also side with other non-Islamic regimes. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. So this whole period of, say, for example, 10th century to 18th century is the period of great turmoil and diversity of politics. This was the period in which you find efflorescence of bhakti movements, right? And largely you can find that their center was Tamil Nadu. And after the collapse of Gupta Empire, you find that bhakti movement in Tamil Nadu emerges as a kind of, what should I say, antagonism against Jainas and Buddhists, right? Because in Tamil Nadu, the great epics of in Tamil like Silapatikaram and Manimekalai reflect Jain or Buddhist worldview, unlike Ramayana and Mahabharata, which reflect Vedic Brahminical worldview, right? So you can see that and very often when we talk of Indian culture, we talk of Vedic culture as being equal to Indian culture, which is not the truth, as you may have realized, because of Buddhists and Jains having their own different worldviews, right? And very often fighting for the patronage at the same time. And many of the Jaina poets and philosophers got patronage under the Mughals, right? So it's not very easy to classify. When we stop thinking simplistically or childishly about Indian literature, right? So that's one of the intentions and objectives of this course, that all Islamic regimes cannot be slotted under a Mughal regime with Aurangzeb as its representative, right? There are all kinds of people, of all kinds of kings, all kinds of sultans who had different polities and different political agendas. And we also saw how British construction of this so-called medieval period or dark ages is based on the writings of these historians who work for these sultans. Most of the historians, so-called Muslim historians, many of them were Turks or Central Asian, or they were Afghans or Persians or Mughals, who were also Central Asian, right? So ethnicity is quite different in all of these. So Mughals would look down upon local sultans as Mughal blood, right? Not pure blood, because Mughals thought very highly of themselves racially, right? There is distinctive racism in Mughal Empire. So they would look at other sultans, Muslim sultans, as if they were chil kawe. That's the term one historian used. Dakkan ke chil kawe, or Mughals were the great rulers. Why I'm telling you all this? Because simplified versions can create stupid understandings, which can lead to, and sometimes, and stupidity has a lot of popularity and it is in demand. Always remember, intelligence is not so much in demand, stupidity is. So to be careful when we talk of Indian histories, and this medieval period, which was labeled as Muslim period by British historians, had their own ideological agendas to grind. Right? They wanted to present themselves. The British wanted to present themselves as saviors who saved the Hindus from the barbaric Muslims. All right. So that kind of narrative was used to justify colonialism, something that we should be uh, uh, careful about. And we can't buy that narrative simply. Okay. So we looked at bhakti of various kinds, and typical this kind of what should I say, confluence of Sufism and various strands of Vedant and various kinds of philosophical schools you find in Kabir, right? So Kabir is probably one of the representatives of this period, and we looked at his poetry. We also looked at poetry of Akka Mahadeva and Basavanna, who were great bhakti poets and founders of Lingayat movement, right? The Veer Saivas, and their poetry being such a powerful expression of. So these are the great poets, Kabir, Basavanna, and Mahadevi Akka, right? And then we moved on to 19th century, and we saw the onset of modernity. By what do we mean by onset of modernity is what we today understand as literature, right? Seems to emerge from this century due to kind of intense encounter with the colonial culture, right? The exposure to Western models of literature, like the genres of novel, short story, travel writing, and so on, seems to have produced a kind of creative spirit in Indians to produce similar things in Indian languages. And we saw that modern novel like Bankim Chandra's Rajmohan's Wife is one of the good examples of modern Indian literature. And this 19th century was also the century when the entire cultural ecology or cultural environment was different, in the sense that technology of printing and the institutions of education and institutions of governance, colonial state, uh, controlled the whole understanding of literature, right? So this is what we find in 19th century, and we find that there were two important streams of thought among Indian intellectuals in the 19th century. One stream of thought said that and both these streams of thought are trying to address the question, why did India lose to the British, right? Why are we enslaved? Why are we colonized? So one school said that we are colonized because we are socially, culturally backward. We have so many superstitions. We have or things like caste system, and in terms of gender also we are extremely regressive. And these social drawbacks are have resulted in this colonial slavery that we experience today. So the reason behind slavery is the progressive and advanced nature of Western society and regressive or superstitious or backward nature of Indian society. So these people wanted to fix this backwardness, and they are the people who people consider as reformers, right? And the other school, which developed later on, especially after 1857, when the British East India Company was replaced by the British Empire, the Queen, and after the introduction of university systems in Bombay, Chennai, Delhi, and Kolkata, there grew a spirit of nationalism, which says that the reason behind the slavery and the downfall of India is not primarily the social backwardness or cultural backwardness, but lack of unity and lack of nationalism, right? So their ideology was idea of producing some form of unified political face against colonial empire rather than reforming Hinduism or reforming the existing religious system. So this second school is in some way precedes establishment of Indian National Congress in 1885. Right, so that is the historical background. So most of the Indian literature of the 19th century reflects these two streams of thought, reformism and nationalism, right? And Bankim Chandra's Rajmohan's wife seems to begin with some sort of reformist view, but Bankim Chandra moves over to the other school in the form of nationalism. And he becomes one of the primary nationalist thinkers, right? And propagators of Hindu nationalism, one of the earliest thinkers of Hindu nationalism, and a very major novelist whose influence was tremendous, especially in his novels like Anand Math and Krishna Kantar Will and many other, Durgesh Nandini, and so on. After that, we looked at another important nationalist writer, himself a freedom fighter, Sri Aurobindo, and we looked at Baji Prabhu as though it is like Mudra Rakshas. This poem is also about something that happened in the past. Its theme is historical, right? Its theme is the great resistance given by Baji Prabhu, right, to the Mughal armies, right, and how 300 brave soldiers of less than 300 soldiers of Baji Prabhu could have this rear guard action and block the advances of Mughals, giving time and space for Shivaji to return with more military power from Raigad. So taking up this theme, Aurobindo makes it a kind of celebration of nationalistic spirit and patriotism against the outsiders. Who they are becomes a problem. He calls them Afghans, and then there are Rajputs as well, and there are Mughals as well. So it becomes a problem. Kaun hai ye? Other kaun hai? Historically, right? And that's the reason why you cannot really look at period before British as Hindu versus Muslim period, right? Because you can see that Shivaji is fighting against a mixed army of Rajputs, Afghans, Mughals, and even the Nizam state, Adil Shahi. Right, so ethnic differences of the enemy you cannot really slot them as Muslims. You cannot really slot Rajputs as Muslims, right? But then what is important for us is that Baji Prabhu celebrates Bhavani, right? Who is the chief deity in the Maratha, what should I say, history, who has influenced or who graces Shivaji and others. So Bhavani is the goddess of Marathas, and that becomes a trope for Aurobindo to talk about Shakti that will lead to the freedom struggle of India. So Bhavani becomes a symbol of Shakti and Shakti as nation, right? So you can see that a very different model of nationalism is being developed or being promoted by Aurobindo, which is which promotes this sacrifice and valor and violence, as against Gandhi, who would prefer or promote non-violent movement. Right. So this celebration of Bhavani, in fact, one of his essays, Aurobindo's essays, is Bhavani Mandir, which talks about how Mother India is imagined as Mother Goddess, or Ma Bhavani, or Mother India, right? So this also is a new rhetoric, new tropes, something that you don't find in pre-British literature in India. So we looked at Aurobindo, and then finally we stopped after discussing Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jiban, which gives you a kind of insider's view towards 19th century Bangla society, largely upper caste Bhadralok society, and the kind of lives that women were living, and her struggle to study, right? And then how she sees the society change before her eyes, where earlier part she had to struggle to study, and then she sees that how girls have now better access to education. It's no longer frowned upon, or it's no longer considered bad. So it tells you about conditions of women, about how many children they had to bear, and kind of chores they had to do, and kind of life that they were living, right, in the 19th century. So this is a kind of overview of the entire paper. Anything that you have to say? कुछ कहना है आपको? So I have summed up the entire semester, the narrative of entire semester for you. इसे कुछ पूछना है तो पूछ लो, कुछ समझ में नहीं आया हो, कुछ डाउट्स हो, कुछ और कहना हो. No? Nothing to ask. So next week we may have one more class for the doubts. I leave that to you. आपको कितने doubt आते हैं, क्या होता है उसके पर. So next week we will meet for a doubt session. This week I will give you your mid-sem marks, and I will have a kind of additional mid-sem as well. Clear? So we meet for continuing this story in the next semester, where we begin from where we left off, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so see you next week then. I will let you know the date. You just tell me when you are ready with your doubts, right? You have time to study. So you just put it in the group that we want a doubt session on this. So we'll have it. Clear?
Yes.
Okay, then see you next week then. What about the essay? Yeah, so essay, which essay? As I said, I leave that. Yeah. So I leave that for self-study, and no, it won't be examined. It's slightly advanced, so I thought that you can study it, but it won't be examined. Nothing that we have not discussed in class will be there for your exams. There won't be anything that is not discussed. So if we have not discussed Sudipta Kaviraj's essay, then it won't be there in the syllabus. Clear?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Anything else? Okay. So see